Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hello, my name is Erin Axelrod, a partner worker owner at Lyft Economy, and I'm joined today by Abdiel López. Abdiel is the Director of Capital Activation at Justice Funders, which is another one of our Next Economy orgs that we love. They're a worker self-directed nonprofit, and Abdiel works there with foundation and investors to shift their investment practices based on the Just Transition investment framework. So as a member of the Integrated Capital team, Abdiel popularizes the framework in philanthropic and impact investing spaces to help build the economic and political power of frontline communities. Abdiel arrives at Justice Funders with a combined decade of experience in undocu-queer youth organizing, arts grant-making, and Indigenous-led economic development. They learned about transformative philanthropic practices when they managed the National Ambitious portfolio as program officer at the Center for Cultural Innovation. And outside of Justice Funders, Abdiel is the founder of the Brown Archive, an experimental art intervention located in an 8-foot by 12-foot corner of their one-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles. They earned a BA in sociology and studied art history at Grinnell College, where they were a Posse Foundation scholar and Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow. Abdiel is Chatino Oaxacan and currently works and lives on Tongva and Chumash territory with their Pomeranian dog child, Horchata. Abdiel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. I'm so happy to be here and share more about our work at Justice Funders. So thank you for having me.
Well, we're so excited because I know there's this new report that just came out, and I know we're going to get into that and you're going to share more about that. But I'm curious for you to elaborate on this journey of how you got to where you are today and the work you do.
Well, I'm going to start off with giving a little introduction on, I think, the history of the Just Transition investment framework and how we got to where we are, if that's okay.
Please.
Because I think that story is also as fascinating, and we'll probably give a glimpse on why we're doing a lot of what we do now. So we started 2 years ago in spring 2021 with funders, foundations, and investors in our network who were interested in aligning their investments with their values. And at the time, they already had adopted some of the mechanics of our resonance framework, which was our first framework released in, I believe, 2018, 2019, which codified regenerative grant-making practices. So that was like the North Star, and many of these foundations had adopted them. Now they were looking to leverage other parts of their assets beyond the grant-making capital to really align with the Just Transition and really the movements that they were supporting. So in spring 2021, we had a few conversations with some of these funders and realized, okay, there is a need for us to codify actually this new sort of guide for philanthropy to leverage their investments. So in tandem with those conversations with our funders, we were talking with movement partners on the ground. Some of them include East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, Rowan Horse Consulting, Climate Justice Alliance, and a few others to start to codify what is now called the Just Transition Investment Framework and help philanthropy really understand how to move in solidarity and move beyond the charity model to support these movement partners on the ground. So that all happened in 2021. In 2022, we were being more intentional about what exactly this codification of the conversations was going to look like. On the one hand, we realized, okay, maybe this could be a prime opportunity for us to develop this toolkit. On the other hand, with our funders, we realized we need to actually park our capital somewhere and start this demonstration project to really activate some of the mechanics that we were codifying in the conversations with our movement partners. So after a few conversations, and when the co-executive director, Dana, came back from sabbatical, we came up with this idea of facilitating a demonstration project or what we now call the Just Transition Integrated Capital Fund, which is a time-limited initiative that our community of funders called the Just Transition Investment Community. It's about a dozen funders in that community and not all of them, but most of them are investing and funding into this, parking their capital in this fund that is then governed completely by our movement partners. So it's all controlled by the people on the ground, by frontline communities. They set up the terms, they decide who gets how much funding, what kind of funding, essentially to demonstrate to the field that it is possible to invest in community-controlled institutions and funds. And actually all of these movement partners have their own community-led loan funds on their own. So it's basically a demonstration project, like I mentioned, time-limited, and hopes to inspire more action beyond the JTIC community and those who are interested in aligning their investments with their values. So that's been the journey thus far. And I will say, I think kind of going back a little bit to the question about my own journey too with this work, is that it is as much a personal healing journey as it is an institutional healing journey. And I think it's important for us to understand the emergence of this work. We can't be doing this just transition work without doing the internal emergent strategy work that Adrienne Maree Brown so beautifully writes about. And so my introduction, as you read in the bio, to this work was 2 to 3 years ago, when I was at the Center for Cultural Innovation and learned about these solidarity economy practices, and really inspired me to maintain hope despite the grief and the violence that was happening due to the pandemic in my communities. And so because I was able to see the Nonis of the world or meet the Vanessa Roanhorses of the world, I was able to sustain that hope. And I hope that through our demonstration project, through this framework, others can start to understand that hope is not living in the abstract, rather it's living in the present. And all this work, what we would call futurist work, is happening in the here and the now. And I'm hoping that funders, investors can start to divest from Wall Street and into Main Street and really start to invest in this infrastructure that's burgeoning, because the risk here is not investing in these community-controlled institutions. So that was a long-winded answer, but I think just hearing that question inspired so much of that thought.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I love how Justice Funders has really done some deep introspection as an organization around how the organization can live into really being a community-based institution themselves. And I don't know if you want to touch on that or if we want to go into the report or...
Yes, I'm happy to, because I think, like I said before, and this kind of stuck to me, which is the personal healing is just as important as the institutional healing, because internally, we also became a worker self-directed nonprofit within the past 2 to 3 years. So this is also a new opportunity for us to guide the field of philanthropy and the nonprofit world, the nonprofit industrial complex, about other models that go beyond the traditional, the norm, if you will. And it doesn't come without a struggle, but I think there's also joy within the struggle of creating spaciousness and flexing and building some of those muscles that have maybe been put to rest because of the systems that we're entrenched in. And through this worker self-directorship model, we're really trying to flatten the organization, create autonomy, and also create opportunities for shared governance. So yes, it has been a journey, and we're still in the thick of it. We're a growing organization, and we're hoping that with the growth comes even more opportunities for that spaciousness and for the flexing of the muscles. And hopefully we can help inspire the field into thinking about alternative organizational models. And I think it's so important too, because what we've seen so far is that the traditional 501c3 sector has not actually supported our communities, our frontline communities. And so now they're experimenting beyond the 501c3 model through LLCs, through cooperatives, you name it. And we're actually telling funders, you have to look beyond what you're overlooking, which is the 501c3 model. What other models are coming up in your backyards that you can invest in, and get creative. Let's get creative over here, and let's start injecting not only money, but also really the whole point of this is to invest integrated capital, which is a combination of resources, whether that's financial or otherwise, to leverage and support these institutions. So as we walk the walk, we're hoping to also kind of guide others who are also interested in exploring these alternative models.
Amazing. And I'm sure many of our podcast listeners are aware of the term nonprofit industrial complex, but I'd love for you to share any definitions that might help folks that might be new to, especially as it compares to what does it mean to be a worker self-directed nonprofit? I'm sure some of our listeners are like, I don't think I've ever heard of that format for a nonprofit.
And I have to admit, this is also really new to me. I come from a traditional nonprofit background. And also, I worked at an LLC prior to joining the worker self-directed nonprofit, so I will say this is still fairly new to me. However, what I've seen so far is, I think it's this idea of allowing the workers of the nonprofit, the staff, if you will, to have autonomy, to have decision-making authority over how the ship is steered, if you will. I think traditionally, nonprofits are very much operate under a power imbalance where the board of trustees, they have a huge say in how the organization should be run. There's a hierarchical leadership structure. And even if we don't end up flattening the organization, there are ways that we're sharing governance, that we're sharing power and authority here. And it really actually ties into the framework about the Just Transition Investing framework that outlines how to share power and shift power into the hands of those that are actually steering the ship and building the ship as we write it, if you will. So I would say still fairly new. We're learning from other organizations like Sustainable Economy Law Center that I think they were the ones who also are, I don't know if they inspired our worker self-directed nonprofit model, but we definitely are looking to them and others. So yeah, we're learning, and we're right now in the thick of refining some of those processes, codifying the practices of our own internal structure. And like I said before, it's a struggle and it's a muscle that we need to flex, and still one that I think hopefully by the end of it, we'll be able to share more with the field about, again, how to think beyond the convention. Yeah, so fairly new, and I'm not sure I can give a succinct definition of this because it's so new. And the beautiful part about this entire work, both as a worker self-directed nonprofit model, but also the framework itself, is that nothing is linear. And I think as we eradicate this idea of linearity, which is it's rooted in capitalist, white supremacist thinking, we can then really lean into curiosity. And I think that's ultimately what we're asking people to do. Lean into curiosity into, for example, if you're a grant maker, what are you hearing on the ground? What is it that communities need? Lean into that. Don't object. I think that oftentimes there can be a paternalistic power imbalance between the foundation and the grantee or investee or community. What we're trying to say is collapse that idea that you know more when those on the ground are actually the ones who are closest to what they should know. So let's collapse the idea of power in that sense. Let's share power. Let's shift power. So lean into curiosity, all these beautiful learnings that are coming both internally and externally.
So many fractals, right? What you just said about grants.
Fractals, yes.
How that plays out in just how organizations are structured, and how so much of the time in these hierarchical structures, we see one person making a lot of decisions and not getting the right iterative feedback from the people that are on the ground interfacing with real clients, customers, and actually making decisions. Having them have more autonomy can actually enhance the whole. So, yeah. It was a beautiful definition, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share a little bit more for our listeners. And you mentioned this report and the resonance with the framework there, and the report has a really great image in it around the different elements. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the report and what the goals are and what it's trying to do to bring our listeners into that.
Yeah, happy to do so. So that image that you mentioned, I would say it's divided into 4 quadrants. And again, kind of pointing back to this idea of nonlinearity, it's not meant to be prescriptive, despite maybe what the graphic could imply. And so this graphic, this framework, this visual framework, really, I think, articulates how to shift power and capital And it specifically goes into these 4 sections of where the money goes. So how are we redirecting assets into local regenerative solidarity economies? How the money moves, which is non-extractive terms or explains non-extractive terms and processes that are self-determined by the community to meet their needs rather than prioritizing profit or the financial needs of the investor. Then also who decides what. So the transference of philanthropic assets to community control is outlined in this particular section, which includes decision-making on who manages these assets and how. And then the 4th section is really how power is shifted. So this new culture and paradigm that is being activated to support community governance and self-determination. So we really go into these 4 quadrants and actually outline. And by the way, just to pause here, our movement partners were the ones who authored this entire framework based on the conversations that we facilitated with them. So this is all co-written by justice funders and our movement partners for funders. And so they've all outlined specific how-tos or action steps to activate specific sections of these quadrants or of the framework rather. If you look at the framework, it gives you specific, even discrete ways to start activating some of these just transition investment mechanics into your work, even if you're not ready to dip your toes into this demonstration project that we're holding. There are other ways to do that in your own backyard, or even leaning into a community of practice, finding funders who are also interested in shifting their investments to more values-aligned practices, right? So it really outlines essentially, this is what essentially a just transition investing would look like. And it's a call to action. It's a call to action to move beyond the grant making. I think there's this significant data point that we always share, which is that 3 years ago in 2020, philanthropic institutions in the US contributed over 13 times the amount of money to the extractive global stock markets as they did to all of their grant-making focus areas. So that's a horrific imbalance of capital allocation in philanthropy. And this is basically a strategy for how to divest from that extractive global stock market and really invest into regenerative economies as we look hopefully toward a more bright future rooted in local economies and reciprocity and being in right relationships with communities on the ground, and really challenging dominant assumptions in philanthropy, such as perpetuity, such as maximum profits or maximum return on investments, right? So we're really, as you're activating these particular mechanics, you're also challenging the assumptions that we've held for so long in philanthropy. And I'll say one last bit about this is that it's really rooted in this idea that philanthropy's money is not philanthropy's money. If we really start to understand where our wealth comes from, more often than not, you'll find it can be traced back to Black and Indigenous communities and the exploited labor of Black communities, the theft of Indigenous land. And so once we start to understand where philanthropy's money comes from, we're able to actually act once we've done the reckoning and actually move towards solidarity, and reparations really is the goal. So I said a lot here, but hopefully funders can read this and get creative and find ways to implement, as I said before, even discreetly. It doesn't have to be a big initiative right now if they can't, but as long as they're taking small action steps that will eventually lead to bigger action items or action initiatives, that's what we're asking, and that's what we're hoping funders will do.
Absolutely. Incredibly said. And so this report really is geared towards funders, folks working with large assets under management. And you touch so much on some of the kind of cultural narratives too around, like you mentioned, perpetuity and cultural narratives around philanthropy being kind of this benign, benevolent force in society. And I'm curious if there's anything else that's coming up for you that you'd like to share around narratives and how those narratives could shift for the better and how you're working on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's, I would say, the crux of my work along with my colleague, Michelle Liu, who's the director of narrative strategy. And we're seeing So I guess let me back up a little bit and say that this year, the goal for us is to cast a wide net, share this out, like you mentioned in my bio, popularize this framework to identify who else is out there who's potentially already doing some of this work, but maybe doesn't have the language of just transition in their vernacular, or someone who is interested, maybe is values aligned, but doesn't really know how to get from point A to point B. So this year, we're casting this wide net. Who else is out there? And how can we support you in this journey? And then in year 2 is to really strategize more deeply to support and work with impact investors or investment advisors, high net worth individuals, those who traditionally wouldn't be at our conferences or at our programming. And so through that entire work of this year into the strategy of next year, we're also hoping to archive the pulse of the ecosystem and show to, and I don't know if this is as much narrative work, or maybe perhaps it is, since it is archival, in documenting what are we saying in these conferences? What are some of the action steps, call to actions that I'm hearing, or that our JTIC community is hearing, Just Transition Investment community is hearing on the ground, and how can we help influence the shift in narrative so that people can start adopting just transition frameworks or ideals, or even how to work in solidarity with the solidarity economy, the next economy efforts, etc. So we're doing a lot of that narrative work on the ground through publications, through conferences, just to hear kind of, okay, this is kind of where the conversation is going in this specific sector, or in that particular area, focus area, if you will, or even geography. And throughout the year, we're also developing workshops and programming to hopefully, again, make this framework popular, mainstream, if you will. So I think the question, or the answer to the question rather, is we are putting ourselves out there. We are listening to our funders. We're listening to our movement partners. We also want to show that, quite frankly, philanthropy isn't moving as quickly as our movement partners need them to. So there's also this need for us to agitate our funders and tell them there are fundable efforts already looking to fundraise in the middle of capital campaigns. Let's fund them. But also, we need to think long-term, think of a strategy to actually implement some of what we're mentioning in the framework in your own portfolios. So yeah, there is a lot of narrative strategy that is involved in all this work. And we're still, I think, in the thick of developing a specific strategy so that in year 2, we can really go in and go to all these different sectors and work even more closely with specific spaces and with specific institutions.
You spoke about hope in the beginning of this conversation, and there's a lot to be hopeful for, especially with the movement partners you're mentioning and all of that. I'm curious, though, let's go into some of the things. What are the things that keep you up at night? What are some of the big issues that are super challenging and hard to crack that our listeners should be aware of?
That's a really good question. And one that does keep me up at night is, how do we move beyond the hurdle of bridging the divide between program staff and investment staff? Because what we're hearing is it might be a little bit easier perhaps to politicize and agitate grant makers, but it's much harder to agitate investors who are very much entrenched in this traditional investing framework and either don't want to or can't move creatively or as quickly as we want them to. So that's exactly why, kind of going back to that, the past question, is why we're deepening our strategy to really hone in on that. Because as we talk to our funders, we realize it's wonderful that our grant makers and program staff are on board, but it makes it virtually impossible to leverage beyond grant-making dollars if the investment advisors are not on the same page as us. So that's what keeps me up at night. That's what I'm strategizing this year, is how can we get to the investment advisors, wealth management offices, to start to open up just a little bit that crack that supports and will unfetter the capital, the resources to our movements. And even in tandem with that, I would say also perhaps something else that keeps me up at night is that there is still a lot to be done. Going back to that first point about the personal healing, we all carry our trauma of money, and that can even be said with our funders too. And they also are going through their own journey as they challenge their own ideas of legacy, perpetuity. So how can we create spaciousness for all these conversations where that emotional labor will take place so that we can actually collectively mobilize and activate these resources for those on the ground? We're in the middle of it. We have this community of practice, and we're hopefully giving at least the funders in our membership the space to think critically about maybe the baggage that they carry when it comes to spending down, for example, and hopefully providing some sort of guidance to continue to move with and alongside our movement partners. So I would say those are the top two challenges that actually keep me up at night.
Those are big ones. Thank you for sharing, giving us a glimpse into that window. Are there other aspects of the report, like case stories of foundations that are spending down as a big challenge to the perpetuity, or just other things from that report that you'd like to lift up?
We have a great community of funders, and we oftentimes ask funders to also represent this work externally. And one foundation that has done an amazing job, and they also have their own framework through which they're investing into communities of color and frontline communities, is Katali Foundation. They've been such an amazing thought partner and collaborator as we start to popularize not just the just transition, but really this idea of restorative economics and the next economy. And I don't know if that's necessarily highlighted in the report, but I think when we realize the importance of this intermediary role and facilitating a conversation so funders can be in the same room as movement partners and build together, I think that's ultimately what I also actually I do want to highlight, that is that so many movement partners have already written guides and frameworks for funders to follow. And what I've seen thus far actually is that some foundations outside of our funder community are still asking movement partners and communities to continue to do that research for them when there's a plethora of resources for them. So it's time to start walking the walk. We've done the research. The research is there. It's time to start reading and activating, and really, again, giving up control to communities that have, just bore the brunt of this extractive economy. So I don't know if there's much more, because this is such an comprehensive guide into the ins and outs of what it would look like to fund this infrastructure. But it's very exciting that we have both communities, the funder community and the movement partners. And I will say something that I am particularly prideful of for justice funders is that we are rooted in the just transition movement. And that's, I think, what separates us from perhaps other philanthropy serving organizations, is that, yes, we are a guide to philanthropy, but we're accountable to our movement partners. And ultimately, that's how we're able to perhaps map this constellation of opportunities for our funders to plug themselves in regardless of where they are on the journey towards regenerative philanthropy, and start moving towards that goal and that shared vision of a regenerative philanthropy. So it's been really, I think it's been an amazing experience working with our movement partners and being the ones who actually agitate the funders and create that extra just layer of support for our movement partners.
Awesome. And Katali Foundation was such a good example as well. Their restorative economies framework and the way they do giving and investment is really a beacon for philanthropy. What are you excited about right now?
Good question. What am I excited about? I mean, there's so much to be excited about. One, from the different projects and initiatives that are coming out of these different communities, to, I think, this willingness, at least within our own funder community, to push the envelope a little bit further, to activate some of these conversations into tangible action steps. And I'm excited about the potential that this entire ecosystem has if we funders can actually invest in this, because our world would look completely different. And a quote that just came to mind for some reason is, one that I hold dear to my heart. And it's by Jessica Norwood, I believe, when she said that if the economy can work for a Black woman, it can work for all of us. So when we really think about this work as a tool for liberation, as a step towards liberation, then I think and I hope we can all see how it affects everyone, not just those on the front lines, but it actually affects even those in foundations. And this work is so imperative to the liberation of everyone. And it excites me to be on this journey and to be, again, interfacing with funders and supporting their own journey as much as we're also supporting the movement partners. I mean, this is a really unique position to be in where we're facilitating the work for specifically for funders, but also our movement partners. And our demonstration project too. I mean, the possibilities there and just seeing what comes out of this community-controlled fund that we're facilitating and hopefully sharing that out in the next year or two from our movement partners. What are they learning? How can we push and shift the needle even more in philanthropy through this demonstration project? And excited to also hopefully revisit resonance framework through this new sophisticated lens of investing. And like I mentioned before, resonance was our first framework specifically on grant making. And I think we've learned a lot more in the past 5 years that I think we could revisit this new framework and pair it up with the Just Transition Investing Framework. So there's a lot to be excited about, at least from, I believe so, but it's all rooted in what's already happening. It's not, again, living in the abstract, it's living in the present. And I hope people can also feel that excitement when looking at examples in their backyards and start investing and getting creative around how to support them.
Well, as we bring our conversation to a close for now, how do people support you in your work? How can people support Justice Funders?
Yes. So first, I would say read the frameworks because you're also supporting movement partners. That's ultimately what we want, right? Is for all of you to support our movement partners. So read the framework. Reach out to us, the Integrated Capital team specifically, if you have questions around the investment framework. And we also are fundraising and we're supporting our movement partners with their own capital campaigns. So if you think you're ready, if your values aligned, practice aligned, and you'd like to support this movement, reach out to us and we'd be happy to work with you. But also, we have, like I said before, a constellation of opportunities that support philanthropy through coaching, through consulting, through an initiative called Harmony for program staff. And so we do have different opportunities where you can plug yourself in. So if you're interested in that as well, just reach out to us. I believe I don't know, I could just verbalize my email address, abdiel, ABDIEL, at justicefunders.org, or reach out to anybody on the team page at justicefunders.org. We'd be more than happy to chat and just think through with you how to best support our movement, the Just Transition movement.
Fantastic. Well, congrats on this work and unleashing this demonstration fund. So excited to see how those assets get deployed and unleashed. And thank you for the really diligent and persistent and not always easy work that you and your team do, and for modeling the values, living them in your organization. It was such a pleasure having you on today. Is there anything you'd love to say to wrap up?
Just follow the communities. Follow the communities. Thank you so much for having me and for learning more about our work. Super excited for your listeners to hopefully lean into curiosity and learn more about our Just Transition Investment Framework. So thank you so much, Erin. This is such a great pleasure.
Absolutely.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before you go, we wanted to let you know that our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA begins on March 26th. If you're an entrepreneur seeking to create a business that works for all life, a member of a team looking to transition your organization into one that is more regenerative and democratic, or someone who's considering a career or livelihood transition in embodiment with your values, we designed this course for you. Over this 9-month learning journey, you'll have the chance to learn practical skills around business and life design based on our work with over 250 social enterprises. In addition to live sessions, you can deepen your experience and practice with special sessions, affinity groups, and connections with over 500 alumni who have participated in the course. Interested in learning more? Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to view our course curriculum and sign up for a free intro with one of our facilitators. If you're ready to sign up, you can use the code PODCASTMBA to save 10% on tuition. We hope you'll join us.